Just stop whatever you're doing for a second. I want you to say something for me. Say the word bottle. Go ahead, say it, bottle. You just did something so extraordinarily complicated, so cosmically, mind-bendingly complex, that the most advanced supercomputer on the planet cannot fully replicate it. In a fraction of a second, your brain fired off a sequence of commands involving over 100 muscles. Your diaphragm compressed, your larynx tensed, your vocal cords vibrated at precisely the right frequency. Your tongue hit the roof of your mouth at exactly the right millisecond, your lips rounded and released. And you didn't think about a single one of those things. You just spoke. Now. I want you to imagine that every single time you opened your mouth, every single time you tried to say your own name, that machine broke down. Not because you were stupid, not because you were nervous, not because something was wrong with you in any moral or intellectual sense, but because deep inside your brain, in circuits so ancient they predate human language itself, a timing signal was firing just slightly off. That's stuttering. And here's what nobody is telling you. Not the speech therapists, not the pop psychologists, not the motivational speakers who say, just breathe and believe in yourself. What nobody is telling you is that stuttering is not a failure of speech. It is a signal that your brain is doing something extraordinary, something that neuroscientists are only now beginning to map, something that touches the deepest questions about what consciousness is, how language works, and why the human brain, the most complex object in the known universe, sometimes gets in its own way. Buckle up, because today we are going inside the stutter. And I promise you, I absolutely promise you, that by the time we are done, you will never think about speech the same way again. Let me tell you something about speech that most people take entirely for granted. You think speaking is simple. You open your mouth, words come out. Fine, done, simple, wrong. Oh, how magnificently, gloriously wrong that assumption is. Speech is the most temporally precise voluntary motor act that human beings perform. More precise than a pianist's fingers on a keyboard. More precise than a surgeon's hands in an operating theater. More precise than a sprinter's legs exploding off a starting block. When you produce a single spoken syllable, your brain must coordinate the following things simultaneously, and I want you to really hear this list because it's going to blow your mind. The respiratory system, your lungs, your diaphragm, the muscles between your ribs, must supply a controlled, pressurized stream of air. Not too much, not too little. Exactly enough. The phonatory system, your larynx, your vocal cords, the tiny muscles that control them called the cricothyroid and the thyroidenoid, must either vibrate that air for voiced sounds or let it pass for unvoiced ones. And the transition between voiced and unvoiced can happen in as little as 20 milliseconds. 20 milliseconds! That is 2/100ths of 1 second. Your conscious mind cannot even perceive events that fast. But your brain is commanding them. Then the articulatory system, your tongue, your lips, your jaw, your soft palate, must hit precise anatomical targets in precise sequences with precise timing to shape that vibrating air column into the sounds of language. And then, all of this must be monitored in real time. Your brain is listening to itself. There is a system called the auditory motor feedback loop that takes the sound you're producing, compares it to what you intended to produce, and adjusts, all in less time than it takes you to blink. Now here is the truly stunning part. All of that, every single millisecond of that breathtakingly complex process, must be perfectly synchronized. The timing must be coordinated across the respiratory system, the larynx, and the articulators with a precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. And the conductor of that orchestra? A tiny strip of neural tissue sitting in the left hemisphere of your brain. The basal ganglia. Remember that name, because that is where our story begins. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Here is where the detective work begins. For most of the history of medicine, stuttering was considered a psychological problem, a nervous disorder, a symptom of anxiety, of trauma, of bad parenting, of weak character. People who stuttered were told to slow down, to breathe, to just relax. They were hypnotized. They were subjected to surgeries in the 18th century. A Prussian surgeon named Johann Friedrich Diefenbach actually cut out sections of stutterers' tongues, because someone decided the tongue was the problem. It wasn't the tongue. The tongue was fine. The problem was never the machinery. The problem was the conductor. In the 1990s, something revolutionary happened. Brain imaging technology, specifically PET scans and later fMRI, became good enough that scientists could actually watch a living brain in the act of speech. And when researchers compared the brains of fluent speakers to the brains of people who stutter, they found something that nobody had fully anticipated. The differences were structural, not emotional, not psychological, not in your head in the dismissive sense, physically different. Dr. Ann Smith at Purdue University, Dr. Gerald McGuire at UC Irvine, Dr. Dennis Drain at the National Institutes of Health. These researchers began mapping a landscape inside the brain of a person who stutters that looks in measurable, repeatable, scientifically documented ways different from the brain of a fluent speaker. And what they found changed everything. In the brains of people who stutter, there is consistently observed reduced white matter integrity in the left hemisphere, the speech-dominant hemisphere, particularly in tracts that connect the speech planning areas to the motor execution areas. The arcuate fasciculus, the superior longitudinal fasciculus. These are the superhighways that carry the neural commands from where speech is planned to where speech is executed. In stutterers, those highways are bumpy, structurally different, less myelinated in some tracts, more convoluted in others. Now here is the plot twist, the glorious plot twist. In the right hemisphere of the stuttering brain, the hemisphere that in fluent speakers plays a secondary supporting role in speech, there is overactivation. The right brain is working harder than normal. It's compensating. It is throwing extra resources at a problem that the left hemisphere is struggling with. The stuttering brain is not broken. It is ingeniously trying to work around its own architecture. That, my friends, is not a defect. That is resilience. That is the brain doing exactly what a brilliant engineer does when one bridge is out. It starts routing traffic over a different bridge, even if that bridge wasn't designed for this particular kind of load. But that detour comes at a cost, and that cost is the stutter. I want to spend a moment, and I mean a real moment, talking about the basal ganglia, because these structures sit at the absolute center of our story, and they are catastrophically underappreciated by the general public. The basal ganglia are a collection of subcortical nuclei, clusters of neurons buried deep in the brain below the cortex above the brainstem. They're ancient. In evolutionary terms, they predate the cerebral cortex by hundreds of millions of years. Fish have them, reptiles have them, your dog has them. What do? In the old textbook view, the basal ganglia were considered primarily a motor control structure. They helped initiate and sequence movements. They were involved in habits, in procedural learning, in the automatization of complex motor behaviors, turning a sequence of deliberate, conscious actions into smooth, fluid, automatic execution. Think about when you learned to drive. At first you had to think about every single thing. Check mirror, signal, check mirror again. Ease off gas, turn wheel. It was exhausting. It required the full attention of your conscious prefrontal cortex. Then, after months of practice, something shifted. Driving became automatic. You could drive while holding a conversation, while listening to music, while thinking about what you want for dinner. The basal ganglia had taken over the routine, freeing your conscious mind for other things. Speech is exactly the same. In a fluent adult speaker, the cortex plans what to say. The basal ganglia execute the timing and sequencing of the motor program. It's a beautiful division of labor. But here's where the stutter begins to make sense. The basal ganglia function through an extraordinarily finely tuned balance of two neurotransmitter systems, dopamine and GABA. Dopamine is an excitatory signal. It primes the system, it releases motor programs, it says go. GABA is an inhibitory signal. It applies the brakes, it suppresses competing motor programs, it says not yet and stop. For smooth, fluent speech to occur, these two systems must be perfectly balanced. The release must be timed with microsecond precision. In the stuttering brain, evidence increasingly suggests that this balance is disrupted. There is too much dopamine activity in the basal ganglia circuits, or more precisely, an excess of dopaminergic drive that triggers motor programs prematurely or causes them to lock up or causes competing motor programs to fire simultaneously. Think of it like this. Imagine the basal ganglia as a traffic control system at a busy intersection. Dopamine is the green light. GABA is the red light. In a healthy system, they alternate perfectly. Green, cars flow. Red, cars stop. The intersection runs smoothly. Now imagine a malfunction. The green light fires too often, or it fires at the wrong moment. Cars start to go when they shouldn't. Other cars are mid-turn when the green fires for the cross traffic. Suddenly there's a jam, horns blaring, gridlock. That gridlock, that momentary inability of the speech motor system to advance from one position to the next, is what produces the blocks and repetitions we hear as stuttering. And the dopamine connection, this is where it gets genuinely thrilling, because there are drugs, approved tested drugs, that reduce dopaminergic activity. Antipsychotic medications like haloperidol and risperidone, and in carefully controlled clinical trials, these drugs reduce stuttering. Not dramatically, not without side effects, but measurably, reproducibly, scientifically. Dr. Gerald McGuire has spent decades studying this. His work on dopamine and stuttering represents one of the most compelling neurochemical stories in the history of communication disorders. He himself is a person who stutters, and he has made it his life's work to understand what happens in the brain's chemistry when speech locks up. The dopamine hypothesis is not the complete picture. Nothing in biology ever is, but it is a central thread. And it points toward a future where pharmacological interventions for stuttering become not experimental curiosities, but standard clinical tools. Here is something that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about stuttering. It runs in families, not in a vague anecdotal, "Oh yes, my uncle also stutters" kind of way, in a precise, statistically documented, genetically traceable way. If you stutter, there is a 60% chance that another member of your family also stutters or did stutter at some point. That is an enormous genetic signal. For comparison, the genetic heritability of type 2 diabetes, which most people think of as a strongly inherited condition, is around 40%. Stuttering is more heritable than type 2 diabetes. So the scientists got to work, and what they found is one of the most extraordinary pieces of the puzzle. Dr. Dennis Drana and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health, in work that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2010, identified mutations in 3 genes that are associated with stuttering. And these genes are not speech genes, they are not language genes, they are not even, on the surface, brain genes. They are lysosomal enzyme genes, GMP-TAB, GMPTG, NAGPA. These genes encode enzymes involved in cellular recycling, in a process by which cells break down and recycle certain kinds of molecular waste. They are genes involved in what is called the lysosomal pathway. Why on earth would genes involved in cellular recycling have anything to do with stuttering? That is the question that should keep you up at night. That is the question that is keeping researchers up at night. One hypothesis: in the developing brain, particularly in the fetal brain during the critical periods of speech circuit formation, these enzymes are required for the proper development and maintenance of the neural pathways that will eventually carry speech signals. When the enzymes are slightly dysfunctional, something goes subtly wrong in the architecture of those pathways. Not disastrously wrong, not fatally wrong. The person develops normally in virtually every other respect. But in the precise circuitry required for the millisecond-level timing of speech, something is just slightly off. And that slight architectural imperfection is what we experience as stuttering. Now here's the suspense within the suspense. These 3 genes account for only a fraction of inherited stuttering cases. Only a fraction. The genetics of stuttering almost certainly involve dozens of genes, maybe hundreds, interacting with each other in complex ways. And those interactions almost certainly interact in turn with environmental factors during development. The full genetic map of stuttering has not yet been drawn. It is being drawn right now in labs around the world. And when it is complete, when we have the full genetic picture, it will almost certainly tell us not just about stuttering, but about the fundamental biology of human language, about how the speech circuits in the brain form, about why those circuits are so precise and so fragile and so magnificently, bewilderingly human. Here is a fact that is going to seem at first completely unrelated to everything I've been telling you. And then, about 30 seconds later, it's going to seem like the most important thing in the world. Boys stutter 4 times more often than girls, 4 times. It is one of the most robust gender ratios in all of neurodevelopmental conditions. It is more skewed than ADHD, 3-to-1. It is more skewed than autism spectrum disorder, 4-to-1, actually similar, and that parallel is not coincidental, as we'll see. But here's what makes it even more interesting. Many children go through a period of developmental stuttering. Roughly 5 to 8% of children will stutter at some point in early childhood, typically between the ages of 2 and 5, as language is exploding and the speech motor system is being assembled. And of those children, the vast majority, around 80%, will recover naturally. And girls recover at roughly twice the rate of boys. Why? This is where hormones enter the story. And they enter it not as a simple testosterone causes stuttering narrative. It's far more complicated and interesting than that. During prenatal development, testosterone exposure shapes the architecture of the developing brain in profound ways. One of its effects is to slow the maturation of the left hemisphere relative to the right. This is a well-documented phenomenon. It's part of why males statistically show different patterns of hemispheric lateralization than females on average. And speech, remember, is largely a left hemisphere function. The primary speech areas, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, the supplementary motor area, are predominantly left lateralized. If testosterone slows the maturation of left hemisphere circuits during development, and if the speech motor circuits are particularly vulnerable during this maturation window, then higher prenatal testosterone exposure in males could contribute to the higher incidence of stuttering in boys. But wait, it gets more interesting. Research by Dr. Nan Ratner at the University of Maryland and others has shown that girls who do stutter tend to have more persistent, more severe stuttering than boys who stutter. Not all girls recover. And those who don't may have more significant underlying neurological differences. Additionally, there is emerging evidence that estrogen plays a protective role in speech motor development. Estrogen promotes neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, to compensate for architectural imperfections. It may be that the higher estrogen levels in developing female brains make those brains more capable of compensating for the same kind of neural timing imperfections that produce stuttering, essentially routing around the problem before it becomes chronic. And then there's cortisol. Cortisol, the stress hormone, the villain that makes an already complicated story even more complicated. Stuttering is famously worse under stress. Every person who stutters knows this intuitively. Job interviews, first dates, phone calls, public speaking. The moments when it matters most, those are the moments when the stutter bites hardest, and cortisol is a big part of why. When you are stressed, your adrenal glands flood your bloodstream with cortisol. Cortisol affects dopaminergic activity in the basal ganglia. It disrupts the very balance, the dopamine-GABA equilibrium, that we already know is perturbed in the stuttering brain. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. This is why the advice to just relax is so maddening to people who stutter. They're not stuttering because they're nervous. The causality often runs the other way. The stutter makes them nervous. The nervousness floods the basal ganglia with cortisol, which worsens the stutter, which creates more anxiety. It's a feedback loop, a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle that has nothing to do with weakness of character and everything to do with the neurochemistry of stress. I want to introduce you to another brain structure that has been dramatically underrepresented in the stuttering story, the cerebellum, the little brain. Sitting at the back of your skull, it looks like a small, densely folded cauliflower. It accounts for only about 10% of brain volume, but it contains more than half of all the neurons in your brain. More than half, in that small space. And those neurons are doing something that, until recently, was thought to be primarily about motor coordination, keeping your balance, coordinating your limb movements, making your motions smooth and precise. But the cerebellum is also a timing machine. It contains what neuroscientists call an internal timing system, a set of circuits that can track time intervals with extraordinary precision from milliseconds to seconds. This internal clock is essential for music, for rhythm, for the coordination of sequences of movements, and you guessed it, for speech. The cerebellum receives signals from the cerebral cortex about what movement is being planned. It then fires timing signals that tell the motor system when to execute each component of that movement. It is, in a very real sense, the metronome of the speech orchestra. Now look at this stunning clinical observation. People who stutter are dramatically more fluent when they speak in time to a rhythmic beat. Metronomes, music, even tapping their own foot. This is one of the most consistently replicated findings in the entire stuttering literature. It is so reliable that it has been used therapeutically for decades. Why? Because an external rhythm provides an external timing signal that substitutes for or augments the impaired internal timing signal from the stuttering person's cerebellum. The external beat does what the cerebellum isn't doing well enough on its own. Similarly, and this is going to sound strange, many people who stutter are completely fluent when they sing, not just more fluent, completely fluent. Mel Tillis, the country music star, famously stuttered severely in conversation, but sang without a trace of disfluency. Carly Simon. Ed Sheeran reported significant disfluency in childhood. Elvis Presley stuttered as a child. Why does singing abolish the stutter? Several reasons. Singing provides external rhythmic structure. It extends vowels, which reduces the transitions between sounds that are the primary trigger zones for stuttering. It changes the feedback loops. The auditory signal reaches the brain differently when singing, and singing may engage right hemisphere prosodic circuits more heavily, activating the compensatory pathways that are already more active in the stuttering brain, leveraging them rather than fighting them. And here is the philosophical implication that should make your brain itch. If stuttering disappears when you sing, if the same larynx, the same tongue, the same vocal cords, the same mouth produces perfectly fluent, melodious speech when wrapped in rhythm and melody, then where exactly is the problem? It is not in the hardware. The hardware is fine. The problem is in the software, in the timing algorithms, in the coordination protocols between brain regions. And software, unlike damaged hardware, can potentially be reprogrammed. There is one more piece of this puzzle that I absolutely must tell you about, because it is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding in all of stuttering research. People who stutter are often completely fluent when they cannot hear themselves. Wait, let me say that again. When a person who stutters speaks while wearing headphones filled with white noise, so loud they cannot hear their own voice, many of them become fluent, or dramatically more fluent. And when they wear headphones that play their own voice back to them with a tiny delay, about 50 to 100 milliseconds, something equally remarkable happens. This is called delayed auditory feedback, or DAF. And for a large proportion of people who stutter, DAF also dramatically reduces or eliminates the stutter. This finding points towards something extraordinary. It suggests that a core feature of stuttering may involve a disturbance in how the stuttering brain processes its own speech signal. Not just the motor output, but the auditory monitoring of that output. Remember I told you earlier about the auditory motor feedback loop, the system by which the brain listens to itself in real time and adjusts? In the stuttering brain, that feedback loop appears to be calibrated differently. The brain may be processing the auditory return signal with timing that doesn't quite match the motor output signal. Imagine you're playing a video game where the controller input has a lag. You press right, but the character moves right a fraction of a second later. Your brain adapts to this badly. You overcorrect. You press right harder, longer, earlier than you should. The character overshoots. Chaos ensues. Now imagine the auditory feedback in stuttering works similarly. The brain sends out a motor command for speech. The auditory system receives the output and compares it to the prediction. But the timing of that comparison is slightly off. The brain detects a mismatch erroneously, and it attempts to correct by freezing, by repeating, by prolonging sounds. The stutter is not the failure. The stutter is the correction, a correction based on a signal that was miscalibrated from the start. This is why DAF works for some people. It shifts the timing of the auditory return in a way that paradoxically better matches the brain's expectation. It's patching a bug by introducing a compensatory delay. This is also why white noise works. It removes the problematic feedback signal entirely. If the brain cannot hear itself at all, it cannot act on a miscalibrated comparison. The speech motor program runs uninterrupted. A device called the Speech Easy, a small hearing aid-like device worn in the ear, uses precisely this principle. It plays the wearer's voice back to them with a slight delay and a slight pitch shift, creating an effect similar to the choral effect, another phenomenon where stutterers are dramatically more fluent when speaking in unison with others. For some users, the device produces remarkable reductions in stuttering. Not for everyone. Nothing works for everyone in stuttering, because the stuttering brain is not one thing. It is a family of related conditions, each with its own specific neurological signature, and the one-size-fits-all approach is one of the historical failures of the field. Now, I have been talking almost entirely about neurology and biology, and that is appropriate because for too long the pendulum swung too far the other way. Too much psychology, not enough biology. I wanted to correct that imbalance, but it would be dishonest and frankly incomplete to ignore what stuttering does to the psychology of the person experiencing it. Because here is something that the neuroscience does not fully capture. A child who stutters, growing up in a world that is often cruel about disfluency. That child does not just experience a speech motor timing problem. That child experiences shame, anticipatory anxiety, avoidance behavior. They learn to swap words, to replace the word they want to say with a different word that they can say fluently. They start sentences differently. They refuse to speak in class. They avoid making phone calls. They construct elaborate linguistic detours around the sounds and situations that trigger their blocks. This psychological adaptation, this learned layer of behavior built on top of the neurological foundation, is in some ways as disabling as the stuttering itself, and it is crucially a different problem. It requires a different kind of treatment. Dr. Joseph Sheehan, the University of California psychologist and person who stutter, describes stuttering as an iceberg. The stutter you hear, the repetitions, blocks, prolongations, is the tip above the water. Below the surface is a vast mass of avoidance, shame, fear, and identity conflict that the listener never sees but that the person who stutters carries constantly. And here's the cruelest irony of the iceberg model. The harder you try not to stutter, the more effort you invest in suppression, the worse the stutter becomes. Because suppression requires cognitive resources. It requires working memory. And working memory is not free. When the cognitive load is high, when you are anxious, tired, distracted, or in a high-stakes social situation, the suppression breaks down, and the pent-up blocks come out with a vengeance. This is exactly backwards from how we intuitively think about skill. If I practice violin harder, I get better at violin. Practice more, perform better. With stuttering, the trying is often the problem. The conscious effort to control speech, the vigilance, the monitoring, the constant internal checking, disrupts the automatic fluency programs that work best when they're left alone. This is a principle that has deep resonances across all human performance. Athletes call it paralysis by analysis. Musicians call it choking. Psychologists call it ironic process theory, the idea that deliberately trying to suppress a thought or action often makes it more, not less, likely to occur. The treatment implication is profound. Sometimes the most effective thing a person who stutters can do, and the hardest, is to stop fighting, to accept the stutter, to allow it to happen without panic, without shame, without the secondary layer of struggle, because that secondary layer is often making things far worse. This is the philosophy behind stuttering modification therapy, developed by Dr. Charles Van Riper, arguably the most influential stuttering clinician of the 20th century. Van Riper, who stuttered himself, developed techniques not to eliminate stuttering but to change its form, to make it easier, more voluntary, less feared, to reduce the iceberg. So where does all of this leave us? I'll tell you where it leaves. It leaves us on the edge of something remarkable. We are, right now, in the middle of what may be the golden age of stuttering research. The convergence of genomics, neuroimaging, computational neuroscience, and pharmacology is producing insights at a rate that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Let me tell you about a few threads that are being pulled right now. The pharmacological thread. Dr. Gerald McGuire's research program at UC Irvine is, as of this writing, among the most clinically advanced. He has investigated multiple pharmaceutical agents targeting the dopaminergic system. His most recent clinical trials have examined a drug called ecopipam, a selective dopamine D1 receptor antagonist, in adults who stutter. Early results suggest meaningful reductions in stuttering frequency with a side effect profile considerably more tolerable than older antipsychotics. Phase 2 clinical trials have been ongoing. This is not a cure, but it is the first time in history that a drug designed specifically for stuttering, rather than repurposed from psychiatry, has entered clinical trials. And it represents a fundamental shift from stuttering is a psychological problem to be talked through to stuttering is a neurochemical problem that can be addressed pharmacologically. The genetic thread. Building on the work of Drana and colleagues, researchers are now conducting large-scale genome-wide association studies, GAUS, scanning the full genomes of thousands of people who stutter to identify all the genetic variants that contribute risk. As this work matures, it will likely identify not just risk genes, but biological pathways, networks of interacting molecular processes that, when perturbed, produce stuttering. Each pathway is a potential target for intervention. There is also fascinating work exploring the genetics of recovery from developmental stuttering. Remember that 80% of children who stutter will recover naturally. What protects them? What genes, what brain circuits, what developmental processes drive that recovery? Understanding recovery is arguably as important as understanding persistence, because those recovery mechanisms might be harnessable, pharmacologically or behaviorally, for the 20% who don't recover on their own. The neurofeedback and brain stimulation thread. Non-invasive brain stimulation, techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS, are being explored as tools to modulate the overactive right hemisphere compensatory circuits in stuttering, or to strengthen the underperforming left hemisphere speech pathways. Early research is genuinely promising. A study published in Brain Stimulation by researchers including Dr. Param showed that stimulating left motor cortex regions, while simultaneously suppressing right motor cortex overactivity, produced measurable reductions in stuttering in adult participants. The effect sizes were modest, but they were real, and they open a door to a future where targeted brain stimulation might be used as an adjunct to behavioral therapy, essentially helping the brain to rewire itself more efficiently. The artificial intelligence threat. And then there is this, the coupling of AI-based speech technology with stuttering treatment. New apps and software platforms are using machine learning to provide real-time, personalized biofeedback to people who stutter, analyzing not just fluency but the specific physiological signatures of upcoming blocks, providing early warning signals, training speakers to intervene at the right moment rather than after the block has taken hold. The Fluency Bank, an international database of speech samples from people who stutter and fluent speakers, is providing the training data for these AI systems. And as the systems improve, they are beginning to reveal patterns in stuttering behavior that human observers have never been able to detect. We are, in a very real sense, building a scientific understanding of stuttering from the ground up, atom by atom, circuit by circuit, gene by gene. I want to come back to the title of this talk. Stuttering isn't a problem, it's a signal. What does that mean? I've been building to this for a long time, and I want to be precise about it because I don't want to be glib. I don't want to minimize the real, daily, grinding difficulty that stuttering causes for the people who live with it. The job interviews, the phone calls, the first days of school, the moments of profound, searing embarrassment, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of being interrupted, mocked, mimicked, finished off, given up on. That is real. I am not dismissing it. But what I mean by signal is this. The stutter is not a random malfunction. It is not meaningless noise. It is a legible message, written in the language of neuroscience, about the architecture of the most complex information processing system in the known universe. It is telling us, here is a brain that is doing something extraordinarily difficult. Here is a brain that is trying to produce language, perhaps the most definitively human cognitive act, with circuitry that is wired slightly differently. Here is a brain that is compensating, adapting, routing around obstacles, recruiting alternative pathways, doing whatever it takes to communicate. The stutter is the sound of a brain trying its hardest, and the message beneath it, the signal behind the signal, is about what it means to be human, because language is not something that came easily to our species. We didn't emerge from the Pleistocene speaking in full, fluent paragraphs. Human language evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and the neural machinery that makes it possible is extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily fragile, and extraordinarily recent in evolutionary terms. We are running 21st century software on 500 million-year-old hardware. It is remarkable that it works as well as it does. People who stutter are not failed speakers. They are people in whom the gap between the complexity of language and the precision required to execute it is, in certain circuits and under certain conditions, laid bare. They are, in a sense, living witnesses to how hard human speech actually is. And that, I think, deserves not just compassion. It deserves respect. I want to tell you about some of the people who have lived this story most fully, Winston Churchill stuttered. The man whose voice, that voice rolling over wartime Britain like thunder, holding a civilization together with nothing but words. That man spent years as a child practicing speeches in his bedroom, fighting his stutter, developing the deliberate, measured cadences that became his trademark. The pause before the hammer blow? Part strategy, part compensation, all art. Demosthenes, the greatest orator of ancient Greece, reportedly stuttered severely as a young man. According to ancient accounts, he would practice speaking with pebbles in his mouth at the seashore over the roar of the waves. Whether or not the story is precisely true, the message is true. One of the most powerful communicators in the history of human civilization was, by his own account, fighting his own voice every day of his adult life. King George VI of England, depicted movingly in the King's Speech, was a man whose stutter was not a personal weakness but a neurological reality, and whose work with speech therapist Lionel Logue represents one of the most remarkable therapeutic partnerships in history. Logue's methods were unconventional. They were based on relaxation, breath management, rhythm, and above all, relationship. On the radical idea that the person who stutters is not broken and does not need to be fixed, but helped. James Earl Jones, the voice of Darth Vader of Mufasa, one of the most recognized voices in the world, spent much of his childhood completely mute. Not just stuttering, mute. He communicated only in writing. His stutter was so severe that he simply stopped speaking. It was a high school English teacher who changed everything. The teacher had him read his own poems aloud to the class, And something happened. The act of performing, of voicing words he had written in a context that had structure and meaning, broke through. Jones has said, one of the hardest things in life is having words in your heart that you can't utter. That sentence is the distillation of everything I've been trying to say today. There is a person in there. There are thoughts, feelings, ideas, arguments, jokes, love declarations, urgent questions, all of them real, all of them fully formed, all of them waiting. And the stutter is the weather at the door. It is not the person. It is not the thought. It is not the heart behind the words. It is the signal, the delay, the brief, bewildering, neurologically complex delay between the person and the world. All right, I've been talking for a long time, and I want to leave you with something you can actually hold on to. If you are a person who stutters, here is what I want you to know. Your brain is not broken. Your brain is different. And different, in this context, means wired with a particular set of challenges in the circuitry that handles the timing and coordination of speech. That circuitry is real. The differences are visible in brain scans. They are measurable in genetics. They are addressable, not always fixable in the complete sense, but addressable. With the right combination of behavioral tools, and increasingly with pharmacological tools, and in the future with technologies we haven't quite invented yet. The shame you may carry, that is not yours. That belongs to a culture that has for most of its history been profoundly ignorant about the neuroscience of communication. That is changing. We are changing it. With science, with imaging, with genetics, with the honest, unflinching examination of what is actually happening inside the brain when speech breaks down. You are not a failed speaker. You are a person doing something extraordinarily hard under neurological conditions that make it harder. Every word you get out is a minor act of courage. And the science is beginning to understand what you've known all along. This is real, this is biological, this is nobody's fault, and it deserves to be taken seriously. If you are not a person who stutters, if you are a parent, a teacher, a friend, a partner of someone who stutters, here is what I want you to know. Do not finish their sentences. Do not look away. Do not pretend the stutter isn't happening. That pretense is kindly meant but often makes things worse because it communicates that the stutter is too embarrassing to acknowledge and shame is the enemy. Look them in the eye. Wait. Give them the extraordinary gift of your patient, unhurried attention. And know that the person talking to you is navigating in real time a neurological challenge that most of us will never face. The thought they are expressing, that is their thought, fully formed, fully human, fully worth waiting for. And if you are a scientist, a physician, a speech-language pathologist, a pharmacologist, a geneticist, a neuroscientist, keep going. The map is not complete. The mechanisms are not fully understood. The treatments are not good enough. There are people, millions of them, across every country, every culture, every language, who are waiting for what your work might give them. Not just fluency, freedom. The freedom to say what they mean when they want to say it without the weight of a world that misunderstands them sitting on every syllable. That is worth working for. That is worth everything.